there is no revolution, there is no freedom, there is no liberation without the South.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio, and I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined by three awesome human beings. T.S. Troutman is an Afropessimist, urban theorist, and anarcho-communist writing on and from the Black South. She's managing editor at Scalawag Magazine. Aja Arnold is an independent abolitionist journalist based in Atlanta, Georgia, and founder of the Atlanta-based magazine Mainline. And for nearly 10 years, Aja has covered music, culture, policing, mass incarceration, and liberation movements in various outlets and different mediums, including radio, podcasts, photography, and film. She's been published in Creative Loafing, The Intercept, Vice, The Appeal, Scalawag, The Objective, and others. And Deshawn Harrison is a trans theorist and Southern-born and bred abolitionist based in Atlanta, Georgia. They are an author, a lecturer, researcher, editor, and a movement media and narrative strategist. They're also the co-founder of the Movement Media Alliance, of which Project Censored is a proud member. So y'all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. This is so exciting.
Yes, so exciting. As I said, first of many, hopefully. So I actually wanted to have y'all on to discuss sort of like a specific piece, but of course, from each piece, so many threads. It was originally published in The Objective, but then I saw it on Scalawag, quote, "As the South goes, so goes the nation. Oral histories from Southern journalists and authors about the news industry's geographical bias." And for those who don't know, the headline is actually, quote, from W.E.B. DuBois, which not only tells us something about the nation, but also the echoing of history that takes us back, of course, even before that and brings us through today. And to quote another rad human, James Baldwin, history is not past, it's the present. So I want to start off here by thinking back and analyzing how our relationship specifically to the South's history, how it's taught, how it's framed, and how it explains where we are now. And I mean this across the spectrum. I grew up in North Carolina. The fact that Southern radical organizing is never taught in schools, but likewise the realities of slavery and how that continues into today. Could y'all just pick that apart a little bit to start with here?
Who wants to start? I'm ready to hop in because you said North Carolina.
Poor Dave, you start.
Yeah, I'm also from North Carolina, born and raised in North Carolina. And you're right, I never even learned about this sort of radical movement history until I moved here to Atlanta for school. And so I think, one, I was really happy when Aja came to us about this piece because there is so little conversation about the South, and particularly how people view the South as this sort of simultaneous detrimental piece of the country, while also the country saving grace, and expecting for those of us in the South, namely Black Southerners, to be this these continued punching bags while also showing up continuously for their salvation. And so when Aja came to us about this piece, I was like, we're absolutely going to do this because there's so much history, even in just, like you said, just the quote itself, "As the South goes, so goes the nation," that I think is just blatantly ignored and oftentimes dismissed. And so, yeah, I have a lot to say, but I also really want to make room for Aja to talk a bit about how you even came to this before I start rambling.
Sure, I'll back up to discuss kind of more of the origin story of the piece and how it ended up becoming an oral history format. This was actually my first published work with The Objective, who, I really admire their work. I feel like they're kind of the working class version of Columbia Journalism Review. We need an industry rag to be critical of our chosen industry and our profession, which is so important. And James Salonga, the editor there that edited this piece, was looking for pitches. And I had a few ideas, and this is the one that percolated to the top of what felt the most relevant, because at the time in the fall, we were, I kind of laid it out to her on the phone, or to them on the phone, as being every time I see a news story that's now national news, I get hit with we've been trying to say this, from the South, we've been trying to say this for like, and it's kind of crazy making. So I really wanted to write about that and wanted to for a long time. And more personally for me, Cop City is a story that Mainline broke, at least regarding like the current iteration of Cop City that we see now. Like these plans have been, work in progress for a while, but when city council had like brought it to, the legislative body in 2021, Mainline broke that story. So that was kind of the initial breaking of that. And then my life was reporting on Cop City for 4.5 years and still going. And just feeling like, the attack on trans people, and it continues, what we've been seeing in Minneapolis with the terrorization by ICE on people, on human beings and all of that. So, and then I interviewed Tia and Deshawn, and other people interviewed were Nisha Powell, who is also a member of our community, incredible author and organizer, and then Ray Geringer, who's in the Appalachia and started a Country Queer. And I asked James if we could convert it to an oral history because I didn't want to cut anything. When I was going through the transcriptions of the interviews, I was like, this piece is about the South being ignored. And I was like, I just want to like showcase and uplift like everything that's being said here pretty much. And hitting up Tia and Deshawn was a no-brainer because like I continue to learn so much from them, and they're two of my favorite people to work alongside with. So yeah, I feel like, I think the bottom line too is that I think Deshawn said it well in the piece, is that I think a lot of it does boil down to folks don't want to honestly reflect on the history. And I think that we've seen like revisionist history continuing by comparing, the current iteration of like the ICE agency to the Gestapo, which completely erases like, Black history in the United States. And like these are Confederates. These are the Nazi Party actually got notes from the slave catchers and people who protected the institution of slavery. And I think it's also important that we recognize that, slavery and the civil rights act, these didn't come from moral places like within the U.S. government. These were all like economical decisions. But I think Deshawn said it best, that people don't want to think about slavery, which is a big problem considering the mass incarceration complex remains to be slavery in and of itself still ongoing. So I'll pause there and pass back to the room.
Yeah, for sure. Like, yes to all of that. And I was very excited when Aja came to me to say that, hey, I'm writing a piece on regional media bias, because I kind of sit at the intersections of media and abolitionist organizing, but also being an academic. And so when you talk about like the way history is taught and learned and understood, the way the South is taught or untaught, or in Afropessimist terms, unthought, like the act of unthinking slavery as never ending, as the thing that is determining all of our structures of violence and oppression, but also capital and accumulation. It's such a rich, nuanced topic. And I'm like, we should be talking about this all the time. Conversations about the South should always lead with this. I know from my perspective, being from Macon, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, when you are taught the quote unquote radical history or subversive history or the history of resistance, we fought back. Even that is not only like sanitized very much, like I'm thinking a lot right now, Jesse Jackson just passed away today, or it was announced, his death was announced today. And I think about, in the context of Atlanta organizing in particular, the way that the history of the civil rights movement is used as a sign to stop pushing, to stop organizing, or to say like, wait a minute, this is Atlanta. Look at our history. We're the home of MLK. Why would you protest here? I remember in 2016 and 2014, the mayor of Atlanta would look us student organizers in the face who were pissed off about police murders in our community, police murders nationally, and say, well, we don't have that problem in Atlanta. And we're like, hey, so here's a list of names that just happened, like Jamarian Robinson happened while we were in the streets protesting for Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And so I think the Atlanta way, I, as a scholar of Atlanta and as somebody who, teaches that, but also just like Southern history more broadly, the Southern history of the U.S. South and the global South, there's a way that not only is that history of revolution and radicalism untaught, but it's also like, if you're going to teach it, if you're going to learn it, if you're going to understand it, here's what we want you to know. Here are the figures that it's okay to teach, and here's what it's okay for you to know that they did and to say that they did. And then the concessions that were won, that were quote unquote hard fought, are then used to preempt further movement. So, a lot of the basis of Cop City being named for what it is, for example, is directly antithetical to Atlanta as the beloved community, Dr. Martin Luther King's beloved community. But Martin Luther King's beloved community was also used to usher in a 20-year regime of environmental or greenwash gentrification that set us up for Cop City. So I like to hold the both end of these tensions, because you're right, like Deshaun, when the South does come online as a space where resistance is possible, then we also have to be like double interrogative of like what it is about Southern history and resistance. And by extension, like that long history of slavery and repressing slave rebellion, how has that animated every structure of policing, of captivity that is pervasive, not just here, but around the world? So I do think like understanding that bias is more than just like, we don't talk about the South, but it's also like the way we talk about the South and the way that we situate Southern movements, for sure.
Did you want to add anything, Deshaun?
At first I did, but no. Now I'm like, what? No.
Well, because like one of the like main themes of what y'all are saying now and what's in the piece is that like there's this flattening and there's the making, it makes it flimsy, right? And they say that journalism is the first draft of history, and journalism today is building flat and flimsy first drafts atop what was already flat and flimsy of yesteryear.
Right.
Oftentimes just dead wrong or ahistorical accounts, in particular of the South. And this kind of like, even just as somebody who grew up in the South, the way that we other places in the South, it's like, oh, West Virginia,
Yes.
they're just a bunch of like idiots and wife beaters. And that's coming from North Carolina. Like, we have no business making fun of West Virginia. Like, and so it's like, there's this also this like really twisted infighting aspect of it. Like, we're not that South. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that aspect of it too, that like this is this kind of flattening and making flimsy of the South is also a way to shift that us into like fighting each other, even just within the South, like not even like above Mason-Dixon, just like there as well.
It's an intentional act that I think people, because of how intentional the state has been about keeping us illiterate, not just in terms of reading, but also media literacy, we fall into this indoctrination that happens, that like where people are taught to believe that there is a lesser than, and that lesser than is over there, right? Like the folks who live in West Virginia don't want to be in the same conversation as the folks who live in Louisiana or the folks who live in Texas, right? The folks who live in Louisiana and Texas don't always want to be in conversation with folks who live in Georgia. And then if you're in South Carolina, North Carolina, you just out of luck, right? Like, and it's like, it's this continued indoctrination to keep us separate, to keep us, like in these boxes, in these sort of like silos, so that we aren't building together, that we aren't looking to find a way forward together with the clear understanding that there is no revolution, there is no freedom, there is no liberation without the South, right? There is no way to even start to make revolution cohere without there being a clear understanding of a necessity for the South to exist at the sort of like central, the eye of this revolution. And so I think a lot about the ways that we fall into these traps, that we fall into these really difficult and horrible sort of understandings of the world that keep us bound to these ongoing narratives, and that keep us from ever really asserting our own power that we have as people and as individuals and as a collective. And it is, I think, what undergirds our disinterest, our inability, our whatever word you want to use there, to actually implement, to actually do revolution, right? We buy into like the aesthetics of it, we buy into the idea of it, we even buy into the sort of like neoliberal idea of it, where revolution is
no more than AOC or Bernie Sanders, right? Like once we get to them, it's like maybe we can go to Jasmine Crockett and that's it. But there's no revolution outside of these politicians, these elected officials. And it's deeply concerning because in all of these instances, we continue to recreate the very same violent structures that we've always lived under, that we've been indoctrinated into, without getting clear about the fact that the South has the very clear power. And I think that the state knows that, and the rest of the world knows that. And when I say the South, I don't just mean the U.S., the domestic South. I'm also talking about the global South. There are such clear and distinct connections between the global South and the U.S. South that we often ignore. Right? There's a very clear connection that Scalawag talks about, that T often talks about, between Venezuela, for example, right, and Louisiana and Texas, right? There's a very clear connection between the U.S. South and Palestine. There are very clear connections between the Congo and the U.S. South, and yet we don't talk about the ways that these connections happen, because that would then require us to really build and really acknowledge the fact that, like, oh, one, there are more of us than there are of them, but two, there are these very clear and distinct connections that we should actually be organizing, writing about, theorizing around together, versus existing in these silos.
Yeah. No, you ate that. I mean, I think too, when you talk about like the across the South, in the South, like infighting, it's very interesting to think about, like, we as Southerners totally understand like the plantation lineage of it all. You know, we know where the Confederacy was, like even just being taught just that history as whitewashed and state approved as a Southern public school at the bottom of the 50 states public school curriculum can force feed us. We'll be clear on that. And then, like, when I'll never forget when I went to college at Alabama, and this was before I had my like left radicalization. So I was a bleeding heart Democrat liberal, and registering people to vote for Obama under his
Weren't we all?
And registering people to vote for Obama in his second term, and like people in Georgia saying, "Oh my God, you're registering people to vote for Obama in Alabama. I know you're really like facing a lot of issues and barriers." And I'm like, voter suppression, like, it's not divided by state borders. Like, it's not just, oh, because we're in Alabama, like it's let's bring out the lynch mob. Like, they share practices across, you know what I'm saying? And that's inherent to the South. So I always think that's wild, while also embracing the plurality of the South. In academia, I was a geography student, and within our sort of Black geography circle, there is a huge move and trend to not just like reclaim the South and tell Southern stories, but then there's also a romanticization that happens in that needs to be problematized. But then we also, at the heart of it, regardless, like learn that the South is absolutely not a monolith. But because it's precisely not a monolith, that means like the tools of fighting structures of violence, like in all of its variations, be it from the coastal South or the mountain South or the Gulf South or the quote unquote deep South and Cotton Belt, like all of these, tools feed into a very important tradition that should be taught in its multiplicity, and also like serve as warning signs about, hey, there's a reason why past movements didn't transcend, both from inside the house and outside forces. That is a powerful path forward. One of my favorite pieces that we published at Scalawag, Sharonda, our editor-in-chief, and I put together just like a long reading list about communism in the South. It's called the Southern Truth About Communism. And, a lot of the books on the list are like, yeah, so in the 1930s, like the US Communist Party, like, it's not like they forgot the South. Like, even Marxist history will say like, well, the South didn't industrialize like the North and the West. And, we'll problematize these sort of presences. And I'm like, well, there's textile factories right here in Georgia. There's ocean coastal access in most Southern states. Like, these ports are important. And, in the present day, it's like, yeah, when we're organizing against mayors sending weapons to Israel, like, yeah, that's happening like in Southern ports. Like they're pulling up to Houston. So how is that separate from some sort of modernization or industrialization? So they try to say like the plantation economy isn't, you know, a part of this sort of communist tradition, Marxist tradition. And here's all of these studies that prove otherwise. Like, it's not just the culture of communist organizing on college campuses or in communities, but it's like actually the structure and the means of the way that the South has moved economically, that this bias, you know, the media, the archive that the media has to work on is already biased against the South, because the South is always excluded from any narrative that people want to be a legitimate narrative. And that, to me, as an Afropessimist, is just like, yeah, that's the anti-Blackness of it all. Like, Deshaun wrote a brilliant piece called, you know, your disdain for the South is just anti-Blackness. To understand the South as a blackened arrangement then makes it clear, like, oh, that's why we can't just neatly include that in histories that we want to be desirable, in narratives we need to be desirable, unless we are exceptionalizing and romanticizing the South as a means of subversion. So, you know, one of my favorite ways to think about it is like, yeah, people love to come to the South for, you know, strip club culture and indulge in our quote unquote fatty Southern food cultures, the foods that you're not supposed to be eating. You come down South, you indulge. Everything about here has to be an indulgence. The only way that you can love the South or call it a home is to render it as it's our origin point. It's, you know, we gave the world the blues. Look at Sinners, you know, what it shows and why it's a crowning achievement at the Oscars. Those narratives they serve a very specific purpose, and it's always necessary to, you know, combat that flattening as we combat the erasure, to like hold like the South is absolutely like not a monolith.
And I would just like to, I don't have really anything to add to what Deshaun T just said, but I would like to dig in some to, and part of your question, Eleanor, you mentioned this like flattening and the flimsiness of, you know, general like national coverage of the South. And I kind of wanted to talk for listeners to hear about like kind of the factors that like allow this to happen, or like, you know, co-facilitate that happening. And it's just, and I think there are like actually practical solutions. So I hope there's like, you know, editors and like publishers like listening to this, and this like, as a working class journalist, like in the South, you know, parachuting is like an industry norm that is like, that I think should just be like, you know, like acts, because they're, you know, I particularly have been studying and paying attention to the local journalism collapse, like in the South, particularly in Atlanta, the creation of like news deserts, which are already very prevalent in the South. And Poynter Institute has some great resources where you can look at a map and kind of track all this. And then the journalism crisis that, you know, was like compounded in 2020 because of the coronavirus pandemic. And so all of those things, in addition to the already like very historical generations long like ignorance and like bias towards the South, you know, and then like really becoming an industry function like in media to leave like Southern reporters and storytellers out of the conversation while reporting on our communities. So I have a lot of stories that I won't get into just for the sake of time, but like, you know, the level of like frustration and like the rage even, and like the grief of just feeling like I couldn't get an editor to pay attention to Cop City, which like it wasn't until Tortuguita was violently shot by Georgia State Patrol officers in a public park during the day in January 2023. That's when people started to like pay attention. And I think there is this like, you know, it's become so normal for major outlets to parachute, i.e. like sending in a reporter like on the ground rather than hiring someone directly there to report on it. And it's like, we really need the work because we have, you know, such a very sparse, the Atlanta, you know, scene I think is more diverse now than, but like Mainline is part of that, right? Like we started, like Mainline was started because of, you know, a collapse, like it hit Creative Loafing, like an alternative media staple here in 2017. That's why like Mainline exists. And we've had some like crop up, but there's still kind of this like inclination to hire a reporter who's not familiar with like, you know, the history of the South and all the nuance of it, will usually get some part of the story wrong. There's like a context collapse. It's usually like very like historical in nature. And there'll be this like, and then I think it's just like very sad, I think, to see some of the things that unfold like in the rest of the country. And as Ida B. Wells said, the importance of the press is so people can be informed to act. And I'm paraphrasing there, but it leaves a lot of people being like, what do we do? And thinking they have to reinvent the wheel. But there is so much Southern resistance in the South. There's in these, Latinx communities organizing together that are, a lot of Black communities, Latino communities, other communities, queerness is erased from the South all the time. Queer and transness is always erased as if queer and trans people are not here. And that's not true. So I think it's painful to hear people being like, how could this happen? And in the South, it's just been talking about voter suppression and abortion bans and this attack on trans rights and the stuff with ICE and the connection to Palestine via the Gilly program out of Georgia State University here in Atlanta that's training these officers. And still no one is reporting on the epidemic of cop cities that are being planned around the nation. The saying that Atlanta influences everything, there's two sides to that coin. There's things people want to enjoy. One of my favorite T quotes is pop culture is just Southern culture refined, which I included in the piece. But yeah, and then I could go on, but just would really love if more people would hire Southern reporters and do that work of fostering those relationships so that we can get these accurate stories out in all this context for the greater public too.
Yeah, I think I want to just add one quick thing, which is that the South is the testing ground, and it is the site at which fascism is perfected to then be disseminated or dispersed around the country and the world. And the reason why that is not a very clear and mainstream narrative in most journalist spaces is because of our refusal or our disinterest in engaging slavery. It's because of our refusal or our disinterest in engaging anti-Blackness and understanding the South as the origin of this position, of this positionality, this ideology. And so we witness the ways that the South is used as a testing ground and still refuse to cover it in that way, because that requires us to talk about slavery. It requires us to talk about anti-Blackness and to then, in some ways acknowledge the fact that we don't actually know everything, that there are people in the South, there is a level of intellect in the South that's not engaged because we don't talk to folks in the South and we don't engage Southern history, all because of this refusal. And so then the South just continues to experience the perfecting of fascism. And then everyone starts asking, like Aja just said, how do we get here? And it's well, we got here because y'all allowed the South to be engaged as the testing grounds for as long as you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to swoop in when it's a presidential election year, such as in 2020, when Georgia was the battleground state, and just so much organizing power to flipping the state blue, which it still remained a red state in practice with Governor Brian Kemp, who's been a Donald Trump for Georgia since before Trump, became president of the United States. And now, ISIS said voter suppression is going to be a hot topic, again, because of the FBI raid here in Fulton County of the the Board of Elections office. My suspicion to lay down the bricks for a dictatorship, to problematize elections, and things like that. So, and then people want to come in and get our votes to flip things blue, and then we're left behind. We don't really see, we didn't see any material, Georgians didn't see a material impact from Joe Biden being president. And we've covered that as well. Actually, in Atlanta specifically, we experienced some of the most heightened forms of fascist repression in the Stop Cop City movement under city Democratic leadership. So the sooner I think that people can recognize that these are, two parties that work lock and step with each other towards a fascist regime, and we can acknowledge, and also everything Deshaun said, and then also the fact that this, land was inhabited by indigenous peoples who were genocided and colonized, which the U.S. will never recognize what's happening in Palestine as a genocide, because America doesn't like to look at itself. So that's to go on to what Deshaun is saying is America doesn't like to look at itself. So that's why it won't look at the South in the way that it deserves to be looked at. And we're just like, call us when we're serious, because we've been organizing and like surviving and resisting like against all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember sitting down in Louisiana when I was down there documenting and also organizing against the Bayou Bridge pipeline. And I remember sitting down with this old guy, and he was like, you know what? You're probably a Democrat. And I'm just going to go ahead and say I don't like the Democrats. And I'm like, I'm actually not. I'm not going to tell you what I am because it'll probably scare you. But I was like, I'm not a Democrat. Let's sit here and talk smack about the Democrats. I could do that all day. And he was like, oh, okay, cool. Let's do that. And then I was like, but also like, what about the Republicans? And it's like, there's this feeling that because the South is predominantly like the red states, like they are, these backwards people. And it's like, no, it's because they are aware that they've been wronged by the Democrats too. It's like that. And that is something that is nationally becoming understood more, I feel like. But everyone's just like, the South, they're just a bunch of, like right-wing nutbags. And I'm like, they don't like the Democrats because the Democrats have sold them out and they're aware of that. Like they understand this.
I need to interject and add, yes, and also voter suppression, chronic, very like longstanding voter suppression, which like there's a narrative I think that's pretty like popular at this point of like whenever something like terrible happens in the South, it's like, well, that's what they voted for. And it's like, no, because slavery did not end and it was converted into a mass incarceration system, which like our economy is still very much like dependent on mass incarceration, like the amended slavery that like America has. Voter suppression, these things are not happening in the South with people's consent. There is like what Eleanor just said, there's that, but there's also the blanket of like voter suppression that has like, this idea of democracy has been like finagled with for a very long time. And I think it's going to be a rude awakening for people in other states that have not had the direct experience of voter suppression and organizing with that.
Yeah, and there's also like the direct link between democracy and colonialism, like who gets to decide who the demos, like who the people are, and we're almost out of time, but I did want to get to this because I think that something that the South also gets like romanticized sometimes, but also just like, people make fun of it, is like the slowness of the South, the speed of the South, which of course, again, as T pointed out, it's not a monolith. It's not like as soon as you like drive into the South, everything just moves slower. But I'm also reminded, because Deshaun mentioned like how this also connects to the global South, and the Zapatistas said walk with the slowest. And I think that another part of this is that aspect of like the 24/7 extractive news cycle. Like I just need a headline. I just need a story. Give it to me. I'm out. I'm going to extract this like gems from the dirt, and then I'm going to leave just this massive hole, this husk. And I want to ask y'all, since you're all journalists and since you're all in the South and you're all working on like this oral history and storytelling, what is the importance of moving at a slower pace? You could call it Southern if you want, but like at a slower pace and actually letting that nuance come up and these differences come up. So we recognize it's not a monolith because New Orleans is not Appalachia, and like it's not Charleston. It's not like all of these places are different, and all of these places have these stories that will connect us to ourselves, and thereby, as goes the South, we can make it into this more radical nation if we want to have a nation. But like that idea of moving at a different pace outside of that cycle.
Yeah, I know T and H are going to say like some really brilliant, I almost said that word. I'm going to say some really brilliant things in response to this. So I want to be really quick and just say, this is one thing that I love about Scalawag, that Scalawag is intentionally not a breaking news publication with this purpose, so that when we get to the news that people are going to be engaging, we're bringing a thoughtful analysis, one that brings people in not only to what that breaking news is, but how they should be thinking about that news and what they can do from there. And I think the thing that I have loved most about organizing in the South, because I have a lot of friends who organize around the country and around the world, there's a distinct difference between how we organize here in the South, for example, versus in New York, where we are like, we need to figure out first why it is that this matters, how we can contextualize this into a much larger context, and then how we can invite other people into this line of thinking to make clear to them why this should matter. And so, yeah, you might not get like, a breaking news story from Scalawag, but you will be able to read an article that we publish that would allow for you to have a deepened understanding of this breaking news. And I think that is the southernness of it all that matters. So I'm only wanted to say that because I know that they have brilliant things to say.
Yeah, I think for me, moving at a slower pace, again, to follow this sort of moving at a slower pace allows for a more capacious understanding and an unraveling of more of the things. I love a structural relation like point. When I moved from Atlanta to Minneapolis in 2020, I to begin a PhD program in geography at the University of Minnesota. And I began working with undergrads, teaching discussion sections for a course on globalization. My understanding of the South, not as just a region or a geography, be it US South or global South, but a structural relation to, what is considered to be center or what is considered to be developed, modern, faster pace, cutting edge, it's sort of antithesis. Then we get to say, well, there's something deeply Southern about, say, racial relations here in the Midwest, or, the way that a lot of like non-Southerners and mostly white students were trying to process what happened with George Floyd at that time. And so, yeah, I always say, and, part of it is, yes, the Afropessimism, but the other part is like being trained as an urban studies person. Like, what is the urban in relation to, say, suburban or rural? Like, again, like the South is thought of as this like rural in relation to, despite the existence of Atlanta and Charlotte and Houston and Memphis. Or they'll say like, well, Birmingham's not a real city, or, these sort of things about a Southern city in relation to other, US cities like a Chicago or a New York. But then when you look at the whole nation, more of our urban centers look like a Montgomery or a Birmingham or an Atlanta or a Charlotte than they look like a Chicago or a New York. I mean, Houston and Los Angeles are very much mirrors of one another. And so, yeah, I think like the structural relation of where does violence roll out, the sort of testing ground understanding, like before we call it or proceed it into, this is capital F fascism and this is its constituent elements. It's like, oh, well, that's just like the way it is in the South, that the way it is of it all. Like beginning to unpack, like, why is a plantation relation the status quo, not just in the South, but then you sit with it for a while, slow it down, and think about sets of relations. What does underdevelopment mean? And in Walter Rodney's terms, like, yes, Walter Rodney's talking about how Europe underdeveloped Africa in colonial terms, but I can also think about the way the US underdevelops the South as points of extraction. And that, to say somebody that I'm talking to in Marxist terms, oh, they can get that, they can gather that. So I think when we're talking about in relation to, like, what has to be blackened and therefore rendered surplus zone, testing ground, we say like the South being red states, yeah, it is the seat of quote unquote deregulation, but what is that code for? And what relations is that code for? So yeah, I think like slowing it down in cultural terms, it may be like, yeah, we can say that the blues is the DNA of all popular music cultures. But what does it mean to make that assertion in a slower way? It's not just to say that, like, yeah, Black folks had the blues and then they put a Elvis white face on it and then that was allowed to, or Black folks great migrated to the North and, Mississippi blues becomes Chicago rock and roll. Like, we say these things in the same way that we know the South invented a lot of eugenics, but then we're surprised that the archives of the eugenicist thinkers are at Southern major universities. Like, this is where they were professors. And so I want us to all like think about all of those things together, like as a relation, and be like, yeah, if I can understand underdevelopment, if I can understand this in relation to that, there's a beauty in a sort of Southern approach or a Southern praxis to sitting with things longer and allowing structures and relations to like reveal themselves.
Yeah, and I wanted to. There's an expression in Spanish that goes "la fastida lente," and it means slow is fast. It essentially translates to like slow is fast and fast is slow. And I think something I also want to raise is that urgency is like one of the like handful, characteristics of white supremacy culture that we've inherited. I want to like also back up and say like, going back to North Carolina where we started this conversation, the notorious burning of Black presses and their newspaper media offices, which also, happened in other parts of the South in the Reconstruction era. That was in 1896 in Wilmington, and it was the, one successful coup d'etat by white supremacists where they overthrew a democratically installed government of like middle class.
My hometown.
Yes, and burned down their media offices, and that was very on purpose. Everything is very intentional. So every, Washington Post laid off like 1/3 of its staff, the other week, very intentional. The AJC, our quote unquote legacy paper here in Atlanta, laid off like 15% of its staff on the same exact day that, they fired 1/3 of the Washington Post. Like, these things are very intentional. And in our industry, as someone who was like trained to become a Western journalist at like Georgia State University, I was taught that, I had to be like really fast. So I started to like unlearn these things when I started to engage in my own decolonization, my own like dismantling of like internalized capitalism and decolonization and white supremacy. And, it's very humbling to realize there's a nifty, people can search for like the 13 characteristics of like white supremacy and, see where you're at. And then but the expression that I mentioned, La Fascina Lente, it means like, you're guaranteed to make more mistakes if you just like plow through and like push through ahead. And I love Scalawag for the reasons that Deshawn like mentioned, for not being a breaking news organization. And Mainline is very similar. We started as slow news and as print, and then we went into a breaking news function like for Cop City because it was like very necessary. Mainline evolved with like community needs, and that's what we needed. And now one of the things we offer are like media trainings because we're trying to popularize these learnings and unlearnings that like folks could do, because we're going to get to a point where the people are really going to have to, the storytelling and the actual reporting, it's going to fall on all of us, whether we're being paid to do it or not. It's going to become, I think, a communal responsibility to tell like accurate and fact-based stories, and like really slowing down and getting into the nuance in history so that we can like move forward with more information and understanding and make less mistakes that have just been repeated over and over through history. And I think that's extremely valuable to analyze, because I mean, imagine like where we would be in the conversation when it comes to like what's happening in our country if more people had known about Cop City, if people knew about Jamarian Robinson, Jimmy Atchison, Oscar Kane, like, it's, as much as, Alex Preddy and Renee Good's lives are, valuable. So is Keith Porter Jr., who most people did not learn about until after Renee Good. If this is folks, Mainline, our editorial about those turn of events in January in Minneapolis, like our main thing is, it's not an I told you so moment coming from people in Atlanta. There is like a very deep grief and rage and like sadness that is being felt here, because like there's just people screaming into the void about Cop City. And Tortuguita was the first known U.S. climate activist to be killed on U.S. soil by police officers. And if that had happened in like New York or Chicago, the whole world would know about it. But because it happened in the South, it was just really ignored. And so it's not an I told you so moment, because we don't want to be right about these things, but we continue to be right in these predictions as like all these things continue to come true. So our thing is that, we're not here, the state is going to radicalize people on its own. And, we're on the B team. I always say we're on the B team. I'll be here when you're ready to like have a conversation, and we will widen the circle. If like this is your line in the sand, people are turning in their MAGA hats. That's like a thing going on in the MAGA movement. And I'm like, you know what? Better to recognize you walked in through the wrong door and walk out than stay in the wrong room. Like come learn and unlearn. And that's like where the slowness like gives us the space to do that. And it's a white supremacist like culturism to resist that, because they don't want us to steep in all of that truth and get a way out of this mess, like, which is abolition. They don't want us to arrive to the ultimate conclusion that abolition is the only answer and the only way out of this. They've been avoiding that since the 13th Amendment was written into the Constitution. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, to all of that. And I feel like I could sit here and talk to y'all for the next like 4 hours, but alas, time being this clock time being a colonialist construct, it still steers things like my daycare. So,
Well,
I want to
thank
thank
you for
y'all.
having us.
I want to thank y'all so much for being here. Folks, please do check out Scalawag Magazine, check out Mainline, check The Objective, check out the work that these folks do. It is vital. It is rad work. And it, again, as the South goes, so goes the nation. So thanks y'all so much. Really appreciate y'all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.